the pandemic for Fair Housing Month. I am Corinne Yance, and I am the Fair Housing Outreach and Education Coordinator at the Champlain Valley for Economic Opportunity. And joining me here today is Jess Hyman, who directs the Fair Housing Project. And we have four panelists that are going to be speaking to us today about Just Cause. We have Brian Pine representing the Just Cause Coalition, Bor Yang from the Human Rights Commission, Michael Monte from Champlain Housing Trust, and Christie Delphia representing the Burlington Tenants Union. And then we really hope to use this space to offer a fresh perspective on Just Cause. The panelists will speak to how similar language similar to Just Cause language is already being used by nonprofit housers across the state, why evictions should be prevented and when they might be necessary, and what Just Cause, how Just Cause can have an impact on housing discrimination, on combating housing discrimination in Vermont. Obviously, Just Cause has been a hot topic here in Burlington as we approach this town meeting day. And thank you everyone for joining us. So we do have around 20 people signed up. It's a pretty good mix of folks who are housing advocates or working in the housing field. Definitely we have some community members that are joining us today and some tenant advocates as well. So we're going to do our best to make sure our language is accessible to all of our audience members. Us housing folks have kind of a habit of lapsing into our housing vocabulary, which can sometimes be a little complicated to know if you're not in the housing field. But if you do have any questions or need clarifications, Jess is going to be on the chat throughout this webinar and connecting us to resources. And she's always happy to unpack any kind of vocabulary that might be unclear. We are recording this webinar, so we'll be posting it on the Fair Housing website, also the Fair Housing Month website, and we have a Facebook Live going as well. This is our first time doing a Facebook Live, so we're kind of curious to see how that goes. And then I just wanted to give a little information about the Fair Housing Project, where I work and Jess works. We are a statewide program that works to protect and expand the fair housing rights of everyone who experiences discrimination and exclusion. And as part of that mission, we coordinate the Thriving Communities campaign, a statewide collaboration to raise awareness about the economic and social benefits of affordable inclusive housing. Each April, we celebrate Fair Housing Month. Because of the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968, which put essential protections into federal law, making it illegal to discriminate in rental, sale, or financing of housing based on race, color, national origin, sex, family status, or disability. Vermont does have the additional protections for age, marital status, sexual orientation, gender identity, receipt of public assistance, denial of development based on income of prospective tenants or prospective residents, and most recently, victims of abuse, sexual assault, and stalking. So this does mean it's against the law for you to be treated unfairly based on your membership of one of those protected classes. And if you're looking for more information on your tenant rights under the Fair Housing Act, Vermont Tenants does include some fair housing information in their weekly tenant skills class. For a more expansive fair housing overview, the Fair Housing Project does lead fair housing trainings for organizations. And of course, the Vermont Human Rights Commission does a monthly training as well. If you're experiencing illegal housing discrimination, we do encourage you to reach out to the Fair Housing Project. especially if you're not sure, we're happy to have that longer conversation with you and figure out if what you're experiencing is discrimination or maybe a violation of your tenants' rights. In the Vermont Human Rights Commission and Vermont Legal Aid, they do enforcement of the Fair Housing Act here in Vermont. Um, After the presentations, which last about 35 minutes, hopefully, we'll unmute participants, or we invite you to unmute yourselves to ask questions as part of our Q&A. And then just a few housekeeping notes. As I said, please keep your mic muted until the end during our Q&A session. And during our Q&A session, you'll be able to raise your hand to ask a question. If you have a question in the meantime, as I said, Jess will be fielding our chat. So please just stick it in the chat, and we're gonna make sure to follow up with everyone registered with a list of resources that we reference. And so now, without further ado, I'm gonna invite Brian to kind of set the stage and introduce us to Just Cause. And from there on out, it'll be our panelists doing their presentations.
Great. Thank you, Corinne, for a really thorough introduction. We are here just a few days before Burlington voters, many of whom have already cast their ballots, but those who haven't will be doing so by Tuesday. The question before us, question number 5, is a question that we've asked this community before. So I just want to give that little historical context that in 1985-86, there was a affordable housing task force, and it was comprised of tenant advocates, tenants, homeowners, landlords, realtors, developers. It was a very diverse group of about 9 or 10 people. One of their unanimous recommendations that came out of that process was actually, I want to share with you, was called Security of Tenure, Just Cause Eviction. Again, unanimously supported by this diverse group. It says, while the law protects apartment owners from irresponsible tenancy, it does not now provide protection for responsible tenants from unwarranted displacement. Security of tenure for Burlington tenants should be protected through the adoption of a just cause eviction ordinance. This will mitigate the displacement and insecurity resulting from our very tight and volatile housing market conditions. Evictions without cause should at least be referred to a local mediation board for resolution. So that was a recommendation 36 years ago. We then followed up a few years later, brought it to the voters. It was an advisory question in March of 1988, at which time the voters said, great idea, let's do it. It was passed pretty soundly. In November of 88, we brought it to the voters as a very specific charter change, not, by the way, with as much specificity as this charter change has. And it was a very vigorously fought campaign. The apartment owners and their allies spent 10 times the amount that tenants and tenant advocates and their supporters spent. And it was defeated by a margin of 48 in favor to 52 against. So we've had this battle, this discussion. Throughout the 90s, we discussed it, but it never garnered enough support to get a lot of attention or get on the ballot again. So fast forward to just a couple of years ago, when the mayor was holding a housing summit, and the Burlington Tenants Union made it very clear that if all you focus on is production of new housing, while that is important, you're not addressing the fact that many of us live in very insecure, unstable situations now as renters. And so they came forward with a list of proposals or demands or proposals, however you want to look at it. And the city council asked the Community and Economic Development Office to really look at that list and write up a report. So that led to the City Council Community Development Neighborhood Revitalization Committee, of which I've been a member for several years, and I serve as chair, holding repeated meetings throughout. Really, it started at the end of 2019, and then the pandemic hit, and we took a few months to sort of get back on track. But in the beginning of the spring of 2020, we engaged in a very, I think, robust dialogue around this. And what I want to say is that I, as a city councilor, and my background in housing, I actually own a small rental property. I don't view Just Cause as a panacea, or as many like to say, the silver bullet. There is no silver bullet, as much as people would like. What we need is what I like to refer to as silver buckshot. We need lots of things happening simultaneously in support of one another to create a system that protects those who are vulnerable because of market forces that put people at risk, both in conditions and in security of tenure. We need the preservation of our existing housing stock, as well as our subsidies and subsidized housing. We need to grow that, but we need to preserve what we have, and we need to produce new. But if we focus on any of those to the exclusion of the rest, we're not really taking this sort of silver buckshot approach, which is a much more, I think, effective metaphor for what we're trying to do. So having said that, I have some slides I'd like to share. I'll go through them fairly quickly because I think the dialogue is really where this conversation gets more rich and robust. So Corinne, if I can go into that now through screen share, I will do that.
You do have screen share access, I believe, but let me know if there's any issues.
All right.
All right.
All right. So from the beginning here, we have prepared this slideshow to really help folks see the issues that are covered by the ordinance, by the proposed charter change. What we did is we put the actual language of the charter change here. I don't want to bore people with that detail. It's available on the city's website. It's a little bit tricky to get to, but if you go to the clerk treasurer's page and you go to elections, you can get to the full wording of the question. This is actually an abbreviated version of that. So let's see, what I can do is close this is not allowing you to, do you see the pictures as well? The faces on the side, or do you just see the slides?
You just see the slides.
Okay, great. I was a little worried about that because I see all of your faces on my slides. All right, there we go. So essentially what just cause is, actually, let's focus on the first question here. Sorry. No cause eviction is currently in place now, giving a landlord the ability to terminate a tenancy at the end of the lease for really no reason whatsoever. There doesn't have to be a reason. During the term of the lease and state law dictates how evictions are handled at that point. But non-renewal is the most, the issue that we're trying to deal with here. So what are some of the arguments for just cause? I think the most basic one is I think captured by what Policy Link says, which is it's an important tool for promoting tenant stability, particularly in low vacancy and expensive housing markets. Burlington has been a low vacancy, very expensive housing market for really most of the last 40 years. So that is a reason why this tool is appropriate to propose in a market like Burlington. Discrimination is an issue that, even though we have laws that outlaw discrimination and we have the Human Rights Commission to investigate complaints, it happens, unfortunately, on a regular basis. And when the Fair Housing Project and Legal Aid have done analyses of what's happening in the market, it's really unfortunate, but discrimination continues to be a major issue for families with young children, for people of color, for people with disabilities. All the protected classes really continue to face discrimination. Just Cause is an effort to really address discrimination and make it so that tenants have one more level of protection to prevent the harmful effects of discrimination. Housing conditions, there's nothing like the fear that retaliation will follow a complaint to code enforcement to keep you from calling code enforcement. So it is widely known that conditions continue to be, in some conditions are substandard, but those conditions get caught only through routine inspections when you don't have tenants feeling that they have the right to speak up and not face some level of retaliation. Again, while retaliation is illegal, it doesn't prevent retaliation from occurring. Really, the rapid turnover of tenants in rental housing is a force that does allow for increases in rents each time there's turnover. Rents continue to rise, and that's part of the escalation of rents in Burlington. We have a very transient population in that we have about 4,000 plus students living in rental housing in the community. And what that does is it moves people in and out of units and allows for escalation of rents every time someone moves in or moves out. So Just Cause is intended to inject a little bit of stability in the rental market to keep that upward pressure on prices from growing each year. I think it's not a stretch at all to say that people who have stability, security of tenure, gives you the ability to do things like plant a garden, plant a shrub, do something around your property, because you know this is a place that you're setting down roots, both literally and figuratively, and that then gives you the stability to be more engaged in the community, whether it's through your children, through their youth activities in sports, or whether it's through school or whatever that would be. It gives people an opportunity. It also gives folks an opportunity to, with that stability comes the ability to plan for the future. And that might mean moving on to the next rung on the ladder of being a homeowner. So Michael Monte will speak a little bit about the nonprofits and how Just Cause is already the law of the land for a couple thousand renters in Burlington. And by the way, this policy exists in countless cities across the country, all of Europe, and in our neighbor to the north in the province of Quebec. So this is not some far-fetched concept that hasn't been tested elsewhere. It's been in effect in other places for a long time. What are some of the reasons why no cause is a good thing? And maybe Michael will touch on why at least sometimes a no cause is what is chosen as an option when you have to. We are told that it allows you to get rid of that problem tenant who isn't really violating the lease or isn't violating any laws, but is just an annoying tenant. And I would say that your annoyance as an owner is, and maybe annoyance to the other tenants is one thing, but putting someone into the potential of homelessness, that's a whole different level of annoyance for people. And I think that's the question, is what is in the hierarchy of needs, your need to not be annoyed by your neighbor, does that rise above someone's need for stability in their life and stability in their housing? Allowing for more turnover allows for the ability to renovate and rehabilitate buildings. As somebody who's been in housing for all of my career, you can renovate buildings with people in it, and you can do it upon natural turnover of tenancy. You don't need this to be, but this is what some advocates for keeping no cause would say is, we need this because when we turn over, we get to really improve the units, and that's better for the housing stock and for the residents. Again, not having needing a reason gives rental property owners the ability to end a tenancy with really no burden of proof, and that at least some owners feel is what is needed. Obviously, those of us who disagree have made our positions known. I think I've heard that this is rent control. I don't know if anybody else has heard that, but the idea that rent control is a bad thing, and this is really just a backdoor way to rent control. It is not intended to be broad market rent control. It is really just intended that if you don't have the protection from exorbitant rent increases, Just Cause really doesn't mean anything. And if you don't have that ability to ensure that if someone gets a massive rent increase as a way to evict them and end their tenancy, that would be a major loophole, and that's why this is in here. What are some of the exceptions? These are exceptions or exemptions that we found in doing our research across the country. These exceptions or exemptions that are listed are all ones that are being contemplated and are included in the charter change language because we felt that there ought to be some flexibility and not have a very, very strict, very stringent and rigid approach. So there are exceptions put in there. What we liked, the committee felt was really important, was to ensure that there be some level of compensation or essentially things like moving expenses and advance notice for tenants. So when someone falls into one of these exemptions, the owner would still have to provide relocation assistance, for instance. I guess that's the way to put it. So that's a list of what we think are important items in Just Cause. and I can turn off my screen share, or you can turn me off, Corinne, whatever. There it is, stop share. That's what I wanted to do. So I think I've covered more than 8 minutes, and I'm sorry that I went over.
Thanks, Brian. And Michael, you're up next.
Thanks so much for the opportunity. I'll try to be briefer than I was intending to. I do have a few things I want to say. A couple of things. One, I want to join the chorus of folks who are condemning the recent campaign against Just Cause and how horrific they have been in terms of their painting a broad picture and sort of taking advantage, I think, of people who are vulnerable. I think it's pretty horrific. I think we could all stand with that and know that that's true. Also know that I was around in the 80s as well, promoting both Just Cause and rent control and a range of other sort of the housing initiatives and programs that I think Burlington now has sort of can use and has used to its benefit. In 2016, CHT, which owns about 2,200 rental units throughout 3 county areas, that owned and manages, read a book, started a book club, and the first book we read was Evicted. That really transformed our understanding of the process of eviction and its impact on people. And so we really began in earnest to slowly transform how we conduct ourselves as owners. Our recent strategic plan says evictions will be rare. That's a statement that's in the plan. We identify, in that case, we identify residents' experience and challenges so we can support them either financially or in some other way, and provide a system-wide plan to respond to residents who may face, we may find ourselves in need of sort of either, typically what we have done in the past is evict them. And we wanted to create a stronger range of support services for residents as a response. Our first initiative back in 2017 was to establish a program called On Track, where On Track supports families to catch up with their rent. So a typical thing is people get evicted because they don't pay. Instead of evicting folks, we work with them in terms of developing a program so they can get basically on track so they can make their rent payments. We've helped about 180 residents in that regard over that few years. And we now teach that program to nonprofit groups across the country because it's been decently successful. The other thing we've done is we expanded our resident services department. So we now numbering about 10 folks. Its primary focus is to prevent evictions, keep people in their homes, keep people housed, and essentially provide ongoing case support, case management, hook them up with services, again, hook them up with education and programming here, get them onto the On Track program. So we really, really pay attention to that sort of as a response to typically where, the case for eviction is a tenant is acting out and is, in some way and is causing troubles. A cause for eviction, we want to even avoid that cause for eviction and do something different. We now, all property managers in our property management department has to really consider every alternative to eviction. So we're looking at things like mediation. We have relocated people instead of evicted people, brought them to a different place because maybe they're not doing well with their neighbors. That is a typical reason why you hear landlords say, hey, we should evict people. Instead, now we're looking at relocating folks, get them into a better place. And we're starting to explore restorative justice practices in order to sort of really make sure that we can bring people into the community. We have a just cause equivalent in our leases. And that basically says that we may not terminate the tenancy or refuse to renew the lease except for serious or repeated violations of the terms and conditions of the lease, or for violation of applicable federal, state, or local law, and for the completion of the tenancy period for transitional housing or for other good cause. Any termination or refusal must be preceded by no less than 30 days by the owner's service. But essentially it says you have lifetime tenancy. You have the ability to stay there for as long as you want, as long as you're a good tenant, as long as you're paying your rent, and as long as you're sort of not violating a lease. And again, what I want to say to you is, even if you are, we won't just evict you immediately. We'll work with you to try to change those conditions so that you're not being evicted. So now we do still have evictions. Right, just the last couple of days, there was someone who was dealing an enormous amount of drugs and stealing everybody's bikes in one of the buildings, and we sort of said, no, you can't stay here anymore as a result of that. So it does happen. And that's a real good cause for us. We've had racism where someone is repeatedly attacking other individuals within the building, and we are moving on that eviction. So there are reasons for eviction, but really it's a just cause. And that's what the ordinance does. We're ready to follow it. So I'll stop there. Really, all I want to say is that we would try to establish a justice orientation in terms of how we do our work. We hate turnovers. We hate people moving out. We want people to stay. We want to give people lifelong tenure and give them an opportunity to be successful. We train our staff in protecting the protected classes. We do all the work we can to make sure that they understand the range of different ideas and peoples and thoughts and the classes that sort of do exist. We control our rents. We do that regularly. We're never going to sell a building. We're always going to make sure that the building stays affordable forever. We're going to always also make sure that if we do any improvements, people have a right to stay or to be relocated to something else. And then under the condition that people are in tough situations, we will provide them with services and support. So that's our nonprofit orientation. That's what CHC does. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Michael, for that insight. And Bor from the Human Rights Commission, I'm passing the mic to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Brian and Michael. I feel like I've learned so much already. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Bor, and I'm the Executive Director and Legal Counsel for the Vermont Human Rights Commission. We investigate claims of discrimination in housing, but in addition to that, also places of public accommodations and state government employment. And I would say that probably the most important thing that we do is enforcement of the housing laws, the fair housing laws. And housing to me is, and I think to all of us here, is a human and civil right. It really is the foundation on which we access all other opportunities. It's the thing that connects us to community, as Brian mentioned, but it also determines schools and where our kids go in Vermont. It determines if we have school choice. That's really important. If your kids are experiencing bullying or harassment, you then have the choice to pull them and put them somewhere else. And that is an amazing opportunity. It determines transportation and healthcare and economic opportunities. If we don't have the right to housing, actually no other right can be fully realized. And that's why housing is so important. Although we don't enforce landlord-tenant laws, we often find that people come to us while they are in an eviction proceeding, or they've been served a notice of termination, or they are at risk of losing their housing. We also see a fair amount of people who have applied for housing but have been denied. So we see a lot of those cases, and housing providers wanting to evict someone or not renewing a lease because they deem the tenant problematic. And sometimes the problems that they identify is that this tenant complains too much, that this tenant doesn't get along with other neighbors or with them. And oftentimes that not getting along might be because of a psychiatric disability, because they have complained about excessive noise, which they have the right to, and a landlord should really be responsive to that. Sometimes tenants with disabilities might ask for a reasonable accommodation, such as the right to live with an assistance animal, and you have landlords or rental housing providers who don't want to provide that. And we know that evictions have like really long-term effects. We have seen tenants who applied for housing but were denied because they had an eviction on their record. We see a lot of housing providers in Vermont who have a rule that says if you've had an eviction within the last 10 years, then you cannot, then we can deny you. Now that is considered a legitimate non-discriminatory reason. So imagine for a second, someone is being discriminated against and they were evicted because for no cause. But the real reason was that because of their race or disability or national origin or whatever. Now, that discrimination has to sit with them for the next 10 years as they are applying for housing. That has now become a legitimate basis to deny them housing for 10 years or longer. Now imagine that the new landlord has 20 applicants, as we often see in Vermont, for that one housing. It's really easy to actually just say no to the person who has an eviction on their record. But we have another layer is, let's say the new landlord is actually also engaging in discrimination. We never get to capture that because they can easily say you have an eviction, and that is a legitimate non-discriminatory reason to deny someone. And so it's sort of a cycle, really, if you think about it. And we're perpetuating sort of that cycle of discrimination against applicants and against tenants, which is very problematic. Just cause eviction, in my opinion, does a really important thing. And it forces the housing provider to articulate its reason for the eviction. It forces them to be transparent in their dealings. And that is a good thing. Now, most of us might agree that that's a really good thing for tenants, but that actually is a good thing for landlords and housing providers as well. Transparency is a good thing. And I'll tell you why, because at the Human Rights Commission, we do investigations into employment and public accommodations law, as I mentioned earlier. Oftentimes, what we find is that the employer doesn't state the real reason why they are demoting or not hiring or not promoting somebody. They use words like, you're not a good fit, or you weren't the most qualified, or very generic terms like that, when in fact they had actually legitimate reasons why they didn't promote someone or why they might have disciplined someone or terminated someone. But instead of articulating those real reasons, they just put out a very generic basis instead. That lack of transparency actually creates an inference that discrimination has occurred. And so when I think of just cause eviction and building in transparency into dealings between tenants and landlords, it is really a good thing for both tenants and landlords, truly. And I think I'm going to end there. I am happy to talk more about the Human Rights Commission, the work that we do, and answer any questions that you have as well. But I want to save time for my other panelists. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Bor. And we will have a Q&A at the end of this webinar, and look forward to some rich discussion there. Lastly, but not least, Christie has prepared a presentation for us as well. Thanks, Christie. Christie from the Burlington Tenants Union.
Good afternoon, everyone. So we all know too well Vermont is a no-cause eviction state. For tenants renting in Burlington, just cause evictions is the first stepping stone along the path to total housing reform. Starting with Burlington being able to regulate evictions brings the ability for towns outside of Burlington to slowly follow in our footsteps and enact their own JCE, so that eventually every town across the state of Vermont will have better renter protections. Renters have been begging and pleading for landlords to stop being able to use no-cause evictions against tenants. No cause has increased the houseless populations, destroyed our neighborhood stability and security, and is undoubtedly one of the worst tools on the landlord's belt. The studies done by Burlington's top housing assistance advocates are very clearly showing that no-cause evictions are destroying our city by instilling fear in the rental community. The mere implications of just cause is immeasurable to tenants, especially in Burlington right now. Just cause gives tenants hope that our city officials across the state, from City Hall all the way to the State House, are now starting to hear the intensity in our voices and are paying attention to the fact that tenants have been pleading for housing reforms for way too long. As a 37-year tenant in the city of Burlington, starting at the age of 17 years old, I have watched the scope of renting change across the city. I can see right in front of me, like it was yesterday, the time in my generation of Burlingtonians where children used to play with their friends on the streets of their neighborhoods. Such games as hopscotch, red light, green light, drawing on sidewalk with chalk, running through a sprinkler, or walking to a local beach with towels around their neck on a hot summer day, showing off that brand new bike you may have gotten for your birthday or Christmas. Can you see it? Or walking in groups to the nearest toboggan hill, a friend's house, or a local park. Parents would feel safe to let their children walk to a nearby friend's house by just standing in their doorways, watching them walk down the street until they arrived to where they were headed, or have them call home when they have made it to their friend's house. Then when it was that time, we'd call to them and say, the street lights are on, come back to the house now, please. Children felt safe with their parents sitting on the porches of their neighbors' houses and apartment buildings, watching them drinking coffee and discussing the latest changes to the Neighborhood Watch program that kept our neighborhoods safe and secure spaces, teaching them how important it is to have good communications with your neighbors so everyone stays safe. The scope of renting has changed to one of desperation amongst the renting community. Low wages, unnecessarily astronomically high rents, and the landlord's ability to throw tenants out onto the streets for no cause after harassing them or discriminating against them has completely destroyed our city. The landlords instill fear in their tenants with this discrimination and harassment. These tactics are disgusting and sometimes unbearably stressful and force parents to keep their children close to home, unable to play in the streets of their neighborhoods, preventing building of relationships as well as making or keeping friends because they don't know if they're going to receive a no-cause eviction due to the landlord's ability to hand them out at will with no oversight. The impact of just cause is huge. Just cause means tenants will be given the chance to start repairing our communities. By allowing tenants to stay in their homes without the fear of no-cause evictions, says Burlington wants tenants to have the ability to become the anchors of our communities by building relationships with their neighbors, thus bringing back the stability, safety, and security they deserve, and will improve our communities for future generations by showing them what safe, stable housing and secure neighborhoods does to improve our city. We must improve the housing conditions and improve tenants' rights and show the tenants of this city that Burlington officials want to bring back security to our neighborhoods and once again see children playing in the streets as their parents sit on the front porch or yard of their neighbor's house or apartment building, enjoying a beverage of their choice and having stimulating conversation about the security that has been brought back to our beautiful space. To break the fear mongering and learn the truth about just cause evictions, go to our website, justcausebtv.org. A yes vote on question 5, just cause, says yes to stable, safe, and once again, secure Burlington, where your best memories of childhood play can be once again for future generations. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Christie. And we'll be moving into the Q&A portion of our session. We already have a couple really rich questions in the chat right now. And I think we're going to start with Andrea Todd's question. It looks like Jess, you might have answered a part of that. I'll just read it aloud. And Brian, you might be the first person to respond to this, but of course, all of our panelists are welcome. So Andrea Todd asked, If 60% of Burlington are renters, what percentage of that number are unjustly evicted, not including end of lease terminations in Burlington? 2, what is the process for implementing this change if it is passed by the voters? And 3, how will this policy be enforced? And Brian, I threw you under the bus because you already
Whoa,
started responding.
those are not easy, but I'll try. So the first one is, I just want to be clear, the vast majority of tenants and the vast majority of landlords aren't involved in evictions of any kind, but no cause is a slice of the eviction universe. So if you look at the data, legal aid analyzed over a 5-year period, the average number was between 350 and 400 a year filed in Chittenden Superior Court. Now, those aren't all Burlington, but Burlington comprises most of the rental housing in Chittenden County. So the majority of those are in Burlington. About 20% in the process that's filed in court were considered no cause evictions. So the numbers are in that math. But I would just say that it's a kind of a misleading figure and it's I know we all want to get data, but it's a bit like saying, and pardon me for using this, I think I have to use this example. If you want to know what is the rate of domestic abuse or domestic violence, do you look at the data, or do you know that there's lots of stuff that never gets reported in the data? And in this scenario, lots of relationships between an owner and a tenant are done through literally word of mouth, in the driveway, in the yard, and it's not going to show up when someone says your lease is coming up in May, and we'd like to go a different way, so you need to be out by then. So that's a real conversation. Never shows up in the data, and advocates hear it on a regular basis. So I don't think it's really necessarily the best metric to use data for this, because lots of the activity that happens never gets captured by the data. So I guess I'm just trying to urge people to be a little more understanding that there's nuance here, that data can't answer that question. So while we want to look to the scientific approach, that isn't necessarily the approach that works in this situation. So as far as a charter change, it gets implemented. It has to go to it. If the voters approve it, it automatically becomes a proposal in the State House. We have a state representatives and state senators who have legislation already ready to go, but it can't be introduced until the voters approve it. So it's literally waiting for being introduced. It then goes through several committees, and it needs to get through both the House and the Senate. And if it's approved by both, it gets signed by the governor, and it would have a date of effectiveness, which usually is July 1st of the year that it gets passed. But it's probably I personally don't think, from my experience, because crossover is a date when things need to be going from the House to the Senate, and that happens like a week after the election, it's unlikely this will meet the crossover deadline. So I think it's likely this will take this session and next session, which means 2022. That's a very likely scenario, just based on my experience with legislation. Then it would basically come back to City of Burlington, and the City Council would go through the process of considering an ordinance. So there would be a time to develop the ordinance, which would be done by staff, and they would seek expertise to do that. They would then come forward with an ordinance that would get discussed and debated by the City Council in an ordinance committee, and then adopted by the full council. So the question about enforcement is one that I'm going to have to punt on that one and just admit I don't know exactly how enforcement will be handled. That'll be decided later. So I'd be making it up if I gave you an answer.
Thanks, Brian. And did any of our panelists want to glom on that response?
I would just like to add, Brian did a great job. I would just like to add a little bit about data too, is oftentimes we are asked by community members or legislators or the governor too, is what is the data on discrimination? How often, like, as if our numbers really capture how prevalent discrimination is in Vermont. And especially in a housing market like Vermont, where affordable housing is so scarce, there's a lot of people who experience discrimination who will never come forward. If you know that your landlord can evict you for no cause whatsoever, even if you know it's discrimination, you don't want that on your record. As I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of housing providers that will not rent to you legitimately if you have an eviction on your record, you're not going to fight that. Your landlord wants to treat you to different terms and conditions or subject you to harassment, you might be more willing to put up with that because you could lose that housing, and finding housing again is incredibly difficult in Vermont. And remember what I said earlier, housing is connected to so many things. If your children, let's say, have disabilities and they're in a school and that school is working really well, but your landlord is subjecting you to sexual harassment, you leaving means you could potentially change those services to your kids. So these are the balances that real people are putting up with in Vermont, and that's why we can't really capture the data. Sometimes we have to move forward on principle and on our understanding of human and civil rights without needing the scientific data to back that up. So that's all I would say to that.
Thanks, Bor. And that actually kind of goes pretty smoothly into our next question, which is about, I think, the process of eviction, if I can scroll down here. And this question comes from Dan Kirk. It's a two-parter. Could one of the experts walk us through how a non-renewal of lease at the lease's terms end, which in parentheses, which I understand is being termed as a no-cause eviction, follows a tenant in applying for future apartments? Is the act of not renewing a lease somehow added to the tenant's credit or other records?
So I guess I could jump in a little bit. A landlord has to sort of decide that it wants to report a person's credit one way or the other. So it doesn't necessarily automatically go to a credit. If a landlord decides and chooses to participate in sort of credit reporting, then one way or the other, no matter what happens, that's not automatic. And secondly, and I'm going to make it up a little bit, I don't think it reflects at all on the individual sort of non-renewal, only if the landlord is asked their opinion, which sometimes landlords do, which we do, which I hate. And basically, if you're asking for another landlord's reference, a landlord might say, I just chose not to renew and not say anymore. So I think I don't think it reflects differently than an eviction on record. I think I got that correctly.
Can I ask a follow-up clarification? So let's say a tenant gets a no-cause eviction, and then the next time they're applying for a rental application, and there's a question: have you been evicted? Do you think it's possible that it sounds like they don't have to say yes to that, but is it possible that a tenant understands the difference, or do they have to say yes if it's a no cause eviction? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, I think tenants have to sign up that they're affirming that whatever they're saying is correct when they apply. So it's up to them to tell the truth, just like when you do your taxes or something like that. You got to, it's up to you to be truthful.
I would have to say they have to put yes, because if you then put no and you sign that lease and your landlord or prospective landlord goes back and checks a couple of months into that lease, they can come back and give you an eviction notice for lying on the application. So it may hurt them in the long run as far as how the landlords choose to see you having that yes on that application, but it has worse implications if you put no as, and they find out you've lied. So you could be putting yourself into a worse position. I mean, if all they're going to tell you is no, you can't have the place, that's better than putting no on the application as a lie and being kicked out once you're already in there. So those are the differences.
Great. Brian, did you have anything to add to that?
I was just going to ask if Bor could clarify for all of us. I believe an eviction is something that gets adjudicated in a court, and that a non-renewal is not a true eviction on your record. Is that correct?
I believe that is correct.
That's correct. I mean, that's how at different times landlords will be able to move through a process and not do an eviction.
Yeah.
By simply not renewing.
Yeah, it's an important clarification, but it does make me wonder that since even in this space of housing advocates that we have to clarify with each other, what is the burden on the tenant for knowing that difference, right? So that can be a really complicated question. And we do have more time for questions. I'm hoping I didn't miss anything in the chat, and Jess, I'm kind of depending on you to make sure I don't.
There is one more of a comment from Allison. Allison is asking if there's time for her to make a comment about vouchers. She works with voucher holders in Burlington through Vermont State Housing Authority. So Allison, yes, please feel free to unmute yourself and.
Hi. So I work with about I don't know, 300 to 400 voucher holders in Burlington, Essex, and Winooski, and I took over for Jean Bluto in 2019. We're having a little shift with our leadership. I have been, in the past year and a half or so, however long that I've been doing this now, doing a lot of reasonable accommodations for exceptions to the payment standards. I hope to be able to continue to do that. I also, when I get an eviction, I'm not taking vouchers away. So I want to just give my contact information to anyone who knows someone that has a voucher through us in the area, that they will not lose their voucher if they get evicted. I think that's really important. And that's a shift that I think we're trying to make at Vermont State Housing, because it used to be the occupancy specialists who would do the termination, but I've been doing and taking on that more and more so that people can keep their vouchers, because we're the boots on the ground and we know more about the situation. So especially if someone is psychiatrically disabled, they should never lose their voucher. So I'm going to give my contact info, and also Christie, I wanted to say thank you for your story about the neighborhood. That was really beautiful. And also, it just spoke to me about like self-governance of neighborhoods, the importance of coming together and protecting the neighborhood, because I have this vision of the alternative happening where Burlington becomes a place that's just like boring and, like desolate and just like full of rich people. Like, I just don't want that to happen. I really don't want to see that happen. And I want to thank you, Michael, because we rely so heavily on CHT to keep it that way. So, I mean, every single voucher holder that is new, I say, and everyone, every day I say, apply to CHT right away. I just barely texted that to someone just now. So yeah, I'm reading, I don't know if anyone else is reading this book, The Voucher Promise. It's really good. I'm going to put that in the chat too. But yeah, anyone can reach out to me, and thank you all for continuing to do this work.
Thanks so much, Allison. It's great that we have you on the call, and we are sharing the resources from the chat to all the people that are registered via email. So stick that stuff in the chat, and we'll make sure that it gets to the people that were on the call today.
Okay, great.
So I have a question. First, is there anyone else in the audience who has a question? Hearing none, I'll barge forward. So a lot of the opposition to this charter change is coming from landlords. And so I would love if our panelists could talk a little bit about how just cause eviction can actually benefit landlords.
Yeah, I can. Every turnover is a bad turnover. Every time somebody leaves an apartment, it costs money. Every time that happens, it's bad for the property. It's bad for the landlord in terms of their financial situation. I mean, we have real justice goals but we also know that every time somebody leaves an apartment, we need to go ahead and we have to bring somebody else in, and it costs some time and money. Now, natural turnover is fine. That's great, but this kind of turnover, where you have an eviction, is really just always not good for us as owners as well. So I would sort of say that the less vacancy, the better for anyone. But can I also just make a statement? I don't think we have it totally right. If I did, I would be like magic, So what I would offer to you all is to always communicate to us, because the one thing we try to do is continue to learn and how to do better and how to make it work. It's never, we really are, evictions sometimes wind up being very fragile issues, for people's lives. We're involved in trying to evict somebody because we could not get anyone to provide them with any support of mental health, yet they're crushing the neighborhood around them. We literally destroy property and the people around them. Sometimes it's the only choice we have in order for them to be able to actually get an alternative choice. That is rare. But what I want to say is that we continue to learn about the small things, teach us about larger issues. And so please let us know so we can learn better. So thanks, Jesse. I went offside there, but thank you.
Thank you. Brian, did you want to add anything to that or have any parting words before you? I know you have to jump off right at 1:30.
Just to say that we have, I think, a very contentious election on this issue. I hope people will talk to their friends and neighbors and family. The misinformation is astonishing. We shouldn't be surprised. You really shouldn't be. But the finance report that was filed by the opposition a week ago showed that they'd spent a little over $4,000. I think based on today's mail that arrived, it's going to be quite a bit north of that. And just be aware that this requires neighbor to neighbor, person to person contact, because I believe that Burlington is both needs this and is ready. But I think the misinformation campaign is going to have an impact. So that's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Christie,
Yep.
Did you have something to add?
Yes, we are finding right now that people out on the New North End are having a particularly hard time with just cause evictions. So if you have any friends or you live in either wards 4 or ward 7, please direct people to the justcausebtv.org site so that we can give you all the information you require to make the correct choice in voting yes for just cause evictions on or before March 2nd.
Thanks, Christie. And Bor and Michael, do you have any parting words?
Just thank you. Thank you for inviting me here today.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah,
for being
thank you.
here. Thank you, Michael. Yeah, thank you everyone for being on this call. We're ending just a minute over. As I said before, our resources will be shared in email. And again, we're just so grateful that the panelists took some time out of their busy days to join us and talk about this issue with us. Thanks, everyone.
Great presentation, guys.
Yeah, great job, Christie, with that storytelling. You really won us over.
That was the point. That's the neighborhood.